Absolutely, yes.
Question. In your visit with the National Security Advisor, you may have sensed her optimism about establishing democracy in Iraq. I wonder if you share that optimism as coming from the country that first established democracy way back when, the principles of it. And secondly, if you see, you mentioned the UN, but what would the role of NATO be in helping to the post-war situation in Iraq and establishing democracy?
Okay. So then, I suppose you prefer to respond to each question as they come. Now, democracy in a country that has never experienced democracy, of course, is a very big challenge, and it is hard to see how people who have never known how to behave in a democratically functioning society, who don't really know what is the rule of law, who do not really know or even appreciate fully the qualities of the virtue of the freedom of speech and the other properties we enjoy, we in the West, in Europe and the States, since centuries, since we have established these principles. It's hard to see really taking root. However, there is a lot of experience in democracy regime formation in other countries of the third world. I believe the United Nations have great experience in helping those nations to acquire these characteristics and structures and norms of behavior. And this is exactly why I believe that the United Nations should be involved in this business, of course, together with the United States and Britain, since they have led the coalition forces which are opening the way for transition of the current regime, of the current situation of Iraq into a new phase. But definitely, I believe that the United Nations have a lot to offer in terms of experience, in terms of wider political support, and also in terms of humanitarian and financial assistance that should flow into that country, which will be bigger the wider the system of nations, the circle of nations that do take part in this. Institution building is a fundamental challenge in democracy building. There's no question about this. Parliament, administration, the justice, all this, the Iraqis will need an enormous amount of political advice and other assistance. I believe that this should be engaged from an international source and international base. Now, on the question of the NATO involvement, I read reports in the press about this, but in fact I should tell you frankly that no official of the American government has suggested this to me during my discussions here in Washington or in New York. And I would tend to think that in the post-war evolution of Iraq, I don't really see a substantial role for NATO. If a military force must be there, I suppose you do have the present coalition forces, which of course would not leave from one day to another. And of course, these coalition forces could be enriched and reinforced by other nations under the authority of the United Nations. So I don't see any immediate reason to involve NATO in a situation which is very complicated as it stands, should not be made even more complicated.
My name is Shazia Rafi from Parliamentarians for Global Action. I wanted to ask you two questions related to the Euro Army. Is its geographical mandate going to be Europe, or it can be actually deployed outside of Europe? And secondly, in terms of the authority to deploy, particularly under peace enforcement, would the Security Council have any role?
The answer to this question is as follows. There is no geographical mandate. It could go anywhere in the world, but there is a political understanding between the European Union and NATO that we would tend to focus in areas which are close to Europe, which are the Balkans, the Middle East, and not perhaps areas which are far away, because in these areas, I don't think that the Euro Army has such dimensions so as to overstretch itself to very distant areas. And moreover, in the Balkans and the Middle East, we do have a historical and political experience, the French, the British, and so on, where our presence is more useful that could be, say, Latin America or parts of Asia or Africa. So this is the political understanding, but there is no formal mandate in that direction. And on the second question, no, there is no formal need to engage the Security Council of the United Nations. However, if there is an international problem with wider implications, such as the Middle East, I would have thought that the Security Council should have a say before we engage in any sort of military action. But in principle, there is no formal obligation to do so.
Yes, my question is in two parts. Mr. Jacques Delors is quoted today saying that
there are other two questions, or one question, two parts. That's an interesting distinction.
One question, two parts.
All right.
Mr. Jacques Delors is quoted today saying that the Iraqi crisis puts off the common defense and foreign policy in the EU for about 20 years, and I wonder if you would agree with that quote. And then I also want to ask you if you could characterize Prime Minister Blair's contribution to this crisis as positive or negative as it affects the EU-American relationship.
Difficult questions. Right. I read an article in today's Financial Times by, actually I can't remember exactly, precisely the author, in which it said that Europe should not develop a military power because it doesn't have the resources or the political will to commit resources to that effect, so as to become a really credible military force at a par, say, with the United States. And that Europe should concentrate on the so-called soft power, which is humanitarian rescue operations, political presence, advice, and other peacekeeping peacekeeping operations. Also, I've read Jacques Delors' interview with the Financial Times. My view is not exactly the same, because I don't think that the dilemma for Europe is either to develop a military force that would eventually grow in an equivalent fashion with the United States, which is one extreme view, or that the Europe should stay essentially with what it has, which has a minimalist, a very small potential for influencing world affairs. I think that Europe, as I see it, should try to develop gradually a stronger military force that could complement NATO, the United States, in operations in other parts of the world, and perhaps in operations of even more aggressive nature than simply keeping the peace. But I would stress that the necessity for the Euro force, the Euro army, to remain within the Atlantic Alliance, within NATO. This is the essential condition. That is, it should develop a capacity to act autonomously, but within the orbit of the Atlantic Alliance and in cooperation and consultation with the United States of America. Moreover, the Euro Army and the European defense is a gradual process. It's not a question of deciding today that we shall be having a very strong military force. This will come in a stepwise fashion. But I believe that the beginning should be now the European Constitution. And of course, as things develop, we will eventually have to decide how much further we shall go down that road. European defense is a dynamic concept. It responds both to the evolution of security threats and challenges, and also it will evolve according to the way we're looked from the point of view of the United States. For instance, will the United States remain committed to European defense and security? Will they keep 80,000 or whatever, 100,000 troops in Germany? All these are questions to which we don't have any answers now. And the way these questions are responded in 5 or 10 years' time will definitely influence the future course of European defense. So I am not in a position to give you a very clear answer. All I'm saying is that we should build a stronger defense force. Now, how stronger it will become eventually will depend on many factors, which we cannot really evaluate now the way in which they will develop in the longer term. Don't forget that defense and security decisions have a very long-term horizon of implementation. You decide something now, even to buy a tank or a fighter aircraft, and you get it in 5 years' time. So it is not something that we have really predetermined in 2003. I think we shall react and adjust as things develop. Now, on the second question regarding the, not the less Britain's, I would say, not to personalize the issue, stand in all this, I would say that Britain's attitude regarding the role of the United Nations was a positive contribution to the working out of the Iraqi crisis. Of course, it is obvious that Britain's effort did not eventually succeed because there was no second resolution of the United Nations Security Council. But I think there is a strong current of multilateralism in the British political system, and particularly in the Labour Party, which I welcome. And I do sincerely hope that this time round, in the post-war reconstruction of Iraq, Britain and others will have a bigger success in involving the United Nations in the arrangements that will have to be put in place.
I am by the former Director of Political Affairs at the United Nations and now the Human Correspondent. Mr. Minister, do you believe that there is now, or that there will be, consensus over the issue of administering Iraq, not in the humanitarian aspect, but administration?
To be frank, I think positions are quite far apart. Although the response I got from the members of the United States government on this were broadly positive in principle, that is, they do accept the need to involve the United Nations in these arrangements, in the formulation of these arrangements. The extent and the degree of United Nations participation is open to question and open to negotiation. And I would also like to report that when I have seen Mr. Kofi Annan today, in fact, at the United Nations, and I reported to him what the United States government had told me about this matter. Of course, he listened very carefully, but he said that United Nations participation should proceed only if it were meaningful. In other words, if it were not restricted simply to provide to the provision of humanitarian assistance. So there are differences on the practical issue of implementing this agreement of principle of letting the United Nations get involved. But I'm not entirely pessimistic, despite the distance of the apparent distance of the differing views, because I think that the recent traumas we have experienced are very recent. I think we should allow time to pass. Anyway, the war has not ended yet, and we don't know exactly when it will end. And consultations should take place in a quiet manner, not in a very public manner. We should not repeat the exercise of the previous resolution discussions about the United Nations resolutions. And I believe that we should eventually succeed in finding common ground on the extent of the United Nations involvement. Moreover, I think that this is the only effective way to reconnect America and Europe, because at the root of the current disagreement is the contestation of the role of the United Nations. So if we agree or coincide on the future role of the United Nations, this by itself will remove the apple of discord, so to speak, in the United States America political debate, United States Europe political debate. So I do hope that we shall find a common ground and a compromise on this. But for the time being, views and opinions and positions seem to be quite far apart.
Mr. Minister, your appraisal of the doctrine of preemption, are there any circumstances under which the European Union would be comfortable with preemption? And how does it square in your own mind
frankly, I've thought about this issue quite a lot, but personally, I find no way to marry international law with prevention. I couldn't understand, a war without any international sanction if one is aggressed and one has no time to go to United Nations or whatever, but has to protect his frontiers and so on. But just claiming that the country presents a danger, a potential danger in the future, and taking action against this country without having any kind of international authority, this, as I suggested in my speech, carries great risks for the international system, because one should not assume that countries have only benign intentions, such as the United Nations, the United States or European countries. Other countries in the world may take advantage of this break in international practice and engage in aggressive wars under the mantle of a preventive war. And I wonder with what authority either the US or the UN or anybody else will prevent them from engaging in this preventive war, in such preventive wars. So I'm worried about this. And that's why I find it extremely important for Europe and the States and others to sit down after the end of the Iraqi crisis and after the passions have calmed down, to rethink about these issues and try to redefine the legal framework for addressing questions such as terrorism and the weapons of mass destruction, which are at the root of this theory of preventive wars.
Question here, then we'll go all the way to the back.
In a similar vein, one of the concerns that I have is to talk about nuclear
If you
weapons.
could just identify yourself. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Steve Brand, Foreign Policy Association.
Sure.
And I hear talk about nuclear weapons possibly being designed, it could be used in terrorism combat. At least the U.S. talks about that. Since the European Army would have French and British nuclear weapons conceivably under its jurisdiction, I don't know if that's been taken and ever going to be used. And I'm wondering if any thought has been given to that weapon system option.
So the question is whether nuclear weapons could be eventually used in the context of combating international terrorism. That is the broad question you are posing. I don't think that anybody has ever suggested this, at least in the European Union. I think that in the doctrine of use for using nuclear weapons, I think it's a doctrine of deterrence, remains deterrence as the theoretical foundation of holding the nuclear weapons. And as you know, deterrence has a meaning only if you do have traditional threats against territorial integrity and others related issues, not asymmetrical threats. I don't think that nuclear weapons could ever be used for facing down asymmetrical threats, and nobody, in my knowledge, has suggested such a thing in Europe.
All the way in the back.
Mr. Minister, my name is Brandon Bolin, and I'm a student member of the FPA. You mentioned that you hope...
Member of the?
FPA, Foreign Policy Association, student member. Mr. Minister, you mentioned that you hope there is a collective security component in the EU Constitution. I just want to know what the likelihood that that will come about is at this point.
That's a legitimate question in the enlarged Europe of the 25. If one were talking about Europe of 15 member states, which are the current members, I think that perhaps could be more likely. With the 25 members, it is less likely, but still, I think it is a feasible development. We shall see. But I would like to make a wider comment on your question. My feeling is that if at the end of the day, when the draft constitution goes for vote, say, in the European Parliament and elsewhere, the common view is that the European Constitution does not go far enough on the road of defense unification that will involve exactly collective defense and the introduction of such clauses. I would not exclude a group of countries in Europe, including Germany, France, other countries, possibly Greece, would move forward with their own military and defense organization in much the same way as as the Economic and Monetary Union moved forward. That is, as a group of nations sharing a number of principles and procedures, and which would form a club, so to speak, which would be open to further accessions as time went on. So I would not exclude creating an EMU on defense and security in much the same way as we created the zone for the euro, which started with 9 members and then eventually other 3 joined, including Greece, and in the future you may have further accessions. So that perhaps would be a more realistic development than including such clauses of collective defense in the constitution of the 25 members.
We're coming to the end here. I'd like to alternate 2 more questions. Over there.
Jeff Lawton. A little closer to home, if I may, Cyprus. Been going on for nearly 30 years now. When do you expect a solution to it all?
That's exactly one of the topics of my discussion with the Secretary General, Mr. Annan, this afternoon. I don't know. It's a short answer, but if you want to develop it a bit further, I would add the following. That, as you know, we have been really very close to achieving a solution about a month ago on the basis of the so-called Annan Plan, which was a very brilliant plan, a very sort of wise plan, which combined features that could be accepted by both communities and had the support of Greece, and we had hoped also the Turkish government. In fact, even the society in the Turkish Cypriot part of the island was in favor of it, as was evidenced for instance, by the fact that about 50 or 60,000 people demonstrated in favor of the Annan Plan in a segment of the island which has no more than 150,000 people. So this was a very strong demonstration. All the elite and the leadership of this community was in favor of it. But there was the negative stance of Mr. Denktash, of the Turkish Cypriot leader, who insists on a different set of principles than the ones embodied in the Annan Plan. Moreover, what was a surprise to us is that while Mr. Erdogan, the new Prime Minister of Turkey, had expressed an initial support for the Annan Plan, and we had hoped that he would press or somehow bypass Mr. Denktash in trying to secure an overall agreement on the basis of this plan, in the very last moment he backsided, he backpedaled, and with the result that the plan collapsed. Now, where do we go from here? On April 16, Cyprus, which means essentially the Greek-controlled part of Cyprus, the official Cyprus, accedes to the European Union. So this creates a new situation. Now, the hope is that under the pressure of the Turkish Cypriot population to join the European Union through uniting with the Greek part and enjoy the financial, economic, and trade and other benefits accruing from that accession. And under the pressure of those segments of the Turkish political system which want to solve the Cyprus problem as a way to reinforce the chances of Turkey joining the European Union, which is their long-standing ambition, a new dynamics will be introduced that will reopen the issue on the basis of the Annan Plan and eventually arrive at a solution. But the precondition for this is very simple. It is that the modernizing and European-oriented forces in Turkey get the upper hand, because Mr. Denktash was able to block the solution because he did have the support of the military establishment of the so-called deep state, which holds the key of power in Turkey and had the capacity to influence and dictate terms, in fact, to the Erdogan government. If the relation of forces within Turkey changes and the modernizing factions get the upper hand, then there is a hope. Now, if you ask me whether I think this is likely, I would say no, it is not likely.
regard to the European Army.
Identify yourself, please.
Kumar Burma, FBA guest, advertising.
Yes.
My question is in terms of the European Army. When you see it necessary to act or be actually put in place outside the NATO or the UN framework, when would you see instances of it actually being to be used, especially in a non-peacekeeping fashion? And the second question was, would the European Army be acting within the mandate of the UN, or would it be acting in its own unilateral fashion?
I answered to the second part of the question, but I will answer to the first part, essentially, which is the new question. Should I? Yeah. Now, the conditions under which the Euro Army will act, of course, are conditions which are created after a military crisis ends. Because the Euro Army, as I indicated, is not an offensive army, it is not an attack army. It is an army for making peace and keeping peace. So the Euro Army has entered into former Republic of Macedonia in the Balkans, it would enter in Kosovo, it would enter in regions where the chapter of military crisis has finished, and then these regions must be pacified and stabilized. So you need an army there to supervise the situation, to control things, and ensure conditions of security and peace. So peacekeeping is its mission. So the Euro Army acts after the military event has finished. That's the essential condition. And I would like to repeat what I said about the United Nations Authority, is that there is no formal link between the European Union and the United Nations. However, in cases where the problems have already attracted the attention of the United Nations, such as the Middle East and so on, definitely we shall need United Nations Authority to go and act. But in other cases, perhaps this will not be necessary. There is no formal necessity or requirement for the Euro Army to ask for the permission of the United Nations. But given the fact that the European Union definitely is differential with the United Nations and usually acts within the orbit of the United Nations, this is likely to take place in most cases.